Jet fuel tastes like burnt pennies. Sarah swallowed the metallic tang at the back of her throat, keeping her eyes fixed on the cracked linoleum floor of the debriefing room. Major Albright was yelling. She wasn't listening. She was calculating exactly how much throttle it would take to vaporize him. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, a dying wasp drone that vibrated directly behind Sarah's right eye. Major Thomas Albright leaned over the dented metal table, a blue vein throbbing beneath the tight, heavily starched collar of his Class B uniform. He smelled overwhelmingly of peppermint antacids and cheap dry-cleaning chemicals. "You broke the hard deck, Captain Jenkins," Albright said, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail against the printed mission report. Tap, tap, tap. Sarah kept her gaze locked on that fingernail. It was far too clean. This man hadn't pulled G's in a decade, if he ever had. She shifted in her molded plastic chair, trying to alleviate the sharp, pinched nerve throb in her lower back. It was a leftover parting gift from wrenching her F-22 Raptor into a brutal defensive spiral over the Nevada desert yesterday. Flying a fifth-generation fighter wasn't romantic. It was an act of sustained, localized physical trauma. Her shoulders were currently mapped with deep purple bruising from the harness straps, and her neck muscles felt like frayed steel cables. She desperately needed a hot shower. She needed a dark, silent room. "I avoided a mid-air collision, sir," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the righteous indignation a movie hero might have possessed. She just sounded exhausted. Miller lost his situational awareness in the merge. If I didn't snap, roll, and dive, we would have traded paint at 600 knots. "You violated training protocol," Albright countered, his pitch rising. He possessed that thin, reedy tone of a middle manager whose authority relied entirely on the brass insignia pinned to his shoulders. "You don't get to cowboy this, Jenkins. You think because you're strapped into a $150 million stealth airframe, you can rewrite the rulebook?" Sarah picked at a loose thread on the knee of her green Nomex flight suit. The fire-resistant fabric was stiff with dried salt from yesterday's exertion and old adrenaline. She didn't feel like a cowboy. She felt like a 32-year-old woman with a crippling caffeine addiction and a lingering, quiet terror of failure that jolted her awake at 3 a.m. most nights. Albright sighed, a heavy, theatrical exhalation. He flipped the manila folder open. "I'm pulling your flight status. You're grounded pending a formal readiness review. Hand over your helmet bag." Silence stretched tight in the cramped room. Somewhere down the hall, a vending machine dropped a soda can with a hollow, echoing thud. Sarah looked up. Her stomach didn't drop. Instead, a hot, ugly bubble of hysterical laughter gathered tight in her chest. She forced it down, swallowing hard, but a weird, crooked smile twitched at the left corner of her mouth. She hated that smile. It always showed up when she felt entirely cornered, an involuntary nervous tick. "Grounded," she repeated. The word felt like chewing tin foil. "Sir, with all due respect, the wing commander." "The wing commander is in Washington until Thursday," Albright snapped, aggressively slamming the folder shut. "I am the acting squadron commander, and I frankly do not care what your service records say, or what kind of boys' club protection you think you enjoy around here. You are a liability. Hand it over." She didn't argue. Arguing felt like wading through wet cement, and she simply lacked the caloric energy. She reached down, her fingers brushing the coarse, heavy nylon of her helmet bag resting on the scuffed floor. Inside rested the custom-molded helmet that fit her skull perfectly. It smelled of her own sour breath, ozone, and hot electronics. Lifting the bag by its heavy webbing straps, she placed it onto the metal table. It landed with a heavy, dead thump. "Dismissed," Albright said, already looking past her to his glowing computer monitor, dismissing her existence entirely. Sarah stood up. Her knees popped loudly in the quiet room. She didn't salute. They were indoors, uncovered, but even the muscle memory of respect was dead in that moment. She turned and walked out. The long, narrow hallway smelled of industrial floor wax and stale coffee grounds. She pressed her palms against the cool, painted cinder block wall for a second, closing her eyes tightly. She wanted a cigarette. God, she hadn't smoked since she was 22. But right now, the ghost craving burned viciously in her lungs. She was grounded, benched by a man with soft hands who chewed peppermint Tums. Tuesday morning tasted like stale donuts and bitter resentment. Sarah sat at a bruised wooden desk in the back corner of the squadron's administrative office, mindlessly sorting through stacks of maintenance logs. Paperwork, the ultimate, crushing punishment for a pilot. The edges of the cheap copy paper felt dry and sharp against her fingertips. Outside the thick, double-paned windows, the Virginia heat was already turning the vast concrete tarmac into a shimmering, watery mirage. She could hear them out there. The low, bone-rattling roar of the F-22s spooling up their twin turbofan engines. The sound vibrated through the floorboards, up through the metal legs of her chair, and settled right behind her ribs. It felt exactly like a heartbeat she was no longer allowed to have. Captain Dexter Miller walked through the door, bringing the sharp, chemical odor of JP-8 fuel and hot asphalt into the sterile, air-conditioned room. He dropped an aluminum clipboard onto the desk next to hers. He didn't look at her right away. "He's making you do the quarterly safety audits," Miller said quietly, his voice raspy from shouting over engine noise on the flight line. "Yep." Sarah didn't look up. She highlighted a long line of printed text in neon yellow. The squeak of the felt tip against the paper was overwhelmingly, violently loud in the quiet office. Miller dragged a grey folding chair over, the metal feet scraping harshly against the linoleum tiles. He sat down heavily, leaning forward. "I went to his office, Sarah. Told him the dive was entirely my fault. Told him I lost tally on the aggressor jet and panicked in the turn. I told him you saved my life out there. And he told me to tuck my shirt in and stop making excuses for a hot dog pilot." Miller rubbed a calloused hand over his close-cropped hair, clearly frustrated. "He doesn't know." "Doesn't know what?" She finally lifted her head. Miller's eyes were bloodshot. The skin around his lower face where his oxygen mask sat was pale, contrasting sharply with his sunburned forehead and nose. "He doesn't know about Syria. He doesn't know why they call you Ghost." Sarah winced visibly. The name felt heavy, like a swallowed stone dropping into her stomach. "Don't, Dave." "I'm just saying the truth. The guy transferred in from Air Education and Training Command. He spent the last 6 years writing training syllabi for desk jockeys. He pulled your file, saw a few disciplinary remarks for non-standard flying, and decided to make you his personal pet project to establish dominance over the squadron. He grounded me," Sarah said, clicking the cap back onto the highlighter. "Dominance established. Mission accomplished." "The entire squadron is pissed," Miller pressed, leaning closer and lowering his voice. "We all know what happened in the airspace over Raqqa. We know exactly why that infantry platoon made it out of that valley. Albright thinks you're just some reckless hotshot who thinks she's untouchable." Sarah stared at the yellow line she had just highlighted. The ink was bleeding through the cheap paper, ruining the text on the other side. She didn't feel like a hero. When she thought of Syria, she didn't think of glory or medals. She remembered the blinding, agonizing glare of the desert sun, the terrifying, suffocating silence of her comms going totally dead, and the metallic taste of pure adrenaline flooding her mouth. She remembered the sheer, animal panic of knowing she was the only physical barrier between 40 terrified guys on the ground and a heavily armed column of enemy armor. She had broken every operational rule in the manual that day, pushing the Raptor so far past its structural limits that the ground crew had actually wept when they downloaded the telemetry data post-flight. She had earned her call sign, but it didn't feel like a badge of honor to wear. It felt like a deep, ugly scar she had to hide under her collar. "Let it go, Miller," she muttered, tossing the highlighter onto the cluttered desk. "He's acting commander. I'll sit in the penalty box, do the mindless audits, and wait for Colonel Hayes to get back from D.C. But Albright wasn't content with merely grounding her. He wanted a spectacle. He wanted obedience performed loudly. At exactly 1400 hours, the plastic squawk box mounted on the peeling drywall crackled to life. "Captain Jenkins, report to the flight line. Hangar 4. Sarah felt a cold prickle of deep unease at the base of her neck. Hangar 4 was the active maintenance bay. She grabbed her patrol cap, adjusted it low over her eyes, and walked out into the oppressive afternoon heat. The sun hit her shoulders like a physical, heavy blow. The outdoor air smelled intensely of melting tar, exhaust, and the sweet, stinging scent of hydraulic fluid. Inside the cavernous, shadow-drenched hangar, the ambient temperature was cooler, but the air felt thick. An F-22 sat jacked up in the center of the vast concrete floor, exterior panels stripped away, exposing the dense, impossibly complex guts of its avionics bays. A dozen pilots from her squadron were standing in a loose, uncomfortable semicircle near the nose landing gear. Major Albright stood at the front, holding a clipboard flat against his chest like a piece of personal armor. Sarah walked up, her heavy boots scuffing the sealed concrete. The faces of her peers were rigid, unreadable. "Captain Jenkins," Albright said loudly, ensuring his voice echoed sharply off the high, corrugated steel roof. "Since you have an excess of free time this week, and apparently a fundamental misunderstanding of how these fragile airframes operate, I thought you could assist the ground maintenance crew with the FOD walk today. And tomorrow. And every single day until your review board convenes. AFOD walk. Foreign object debris. It meant walking shoulder to shoulder, in a slow, agonizing line across the scorching tarmac, eyes glued to the ground, picking up loose pebbles, stray safety wire, and wind-blown trash so it wouldn't get sucked into a multi-million-dollar jet engine. It was entirely necessary, vital work, but using it as a public punishment for a senior, combat-decorated pilot was a highly calculated insult. It was designed specifically to humiliate her in front of the men and women she flew with. Sarah felt a sudden rush of heat flooding her cheeks. It wasn't from anger, but from an intense, sickening wave of pure embarrassment. She felt incredibly small, stripped bare. She wanted to shrink into the oily, stained floor. She glanced sideways at the other pilots. Miller was staring a hole straight through Albright's head, his jaw muscles jumping. "Sir," Sarah kept her voice dangerously quiet, hoping to contain the fallout. "A FOD walk. Is there a problem, Captain?" Albright's smile was thin, tight, and thoroughly cruel. "Are you too good to pick up trash? Maybe if you cared a little more about the actual aircraft, you wouldn't abuse them in the air." She unclenched her jaw. Her teeth physically ached from grinding them together. The pungent smell of aerosol solvent drifting from the tool bench was making her intensely nauseous. She could fight it. She could scream, point fingers, bring up her record, demand respect. But she looked over at the F-22, resting helplessly on its bright yellow jacks, looking broken and vulnerable in the dim light, and all the fight simply drained out of her veins. "No problem, sir," she said, her voice barely a rough scrape of sound. Albright nodded, visibly satisfied with her submission. "Good. Start at the north apron." He turned on his polished heel and marched purposefully out of the hangar doors. The remaining silence left in his wake was thick, heavy with suffocating, unspoken tension. Sarah didn't look at Miller. She didn't look at anyone. She just turned slowly toward the blinding, blazing rectangle of sunlight waiting at the open hangar doors. Her shoulders slumped, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the military bureaucracy grinding her down to nothing. Heat radiated off the vast concrete apron in visible, distorted waves. It felt less like weather and more like an open oven door pressed directly against Sarah's face. She walked slowly, her eyes tracking the microscopic topography of the tarmac. The thick rubber soles of her boots felt permanently sticky, grabbing at the melting sealant in the expansion joints with a quiet, sickening sh-tuck sound every time she shifted her weight. She held a yellow plastic bucket in her left hand. It contained 3 twisted pieces of safety wire, a rusted washer, and a crumpled gum wrapper. Her right hand ached. A dull, throbbing pulse settled deep in her knuckles. She wasn't angry anymore. She was hollowed out, scraped clean by the sheer, petty absurdity of it all. The sun beat down on the back of her neck, right where her patrol cap ended and the collar of her t-shirt began. The skin there was already tightening, radiating a sharp, prickly heat that warned of a severe sunburn by evening. A high-pitched, whining spool-up of an auxiliary power unit shrieked across the flight line, forcing her to grind her teeth against the noise. She paused, wiping her forehead with the back of her wrist, leaving a streak of grease across her brow. Then she heard the door. It was the heavy, steel crash bar of the Squadron operations building slamming open. The sound was distinct, carrying a sharp metallic slap that cut right through the low ambient rumble of the base. Sarah didn't look up immediately. She nudged a piece of crushed gravel with the toe of her boot, entirely focused on maintaining her isolated bubble of misery. Footsteps approached. Not a casual walk, but the heavy, deliberate march of flight boots hitting the concrete in unison. "Captain?" Sarah stopped. She turned her head slowly, the vertebrae in her neck popping. Captain Dexter Miller stood 10 feet away. He was not in his daily administrative uniform. He wore his full green flight suit, zippered to the collar, sleeves rolled up past the elbows, revealing forearms thick with dark hair and a smattering of pale, faded scars. His face was a hard, unreadable mask, jaws clamped tight. He didn't say another word. He simply stepped forward, aligning his boots directly beside hers on the imaginary grid line of the tarmac. He lowered his chin, fixing his eyes on the blistering concrete, and began to walk forward at a slow, agonizing crawl. Sarah swallowed hard. A weird, tight lump formed instantly in the back of her throat, thick and suffocating. "Dave, what are you doing? You have a simulator block in 20 minutes. Sim is down," Miller lied, his voice flat, never breaking his gaze from the ground. "Software glitch. Figured I could use some fresh air." Before Sarah could formulate a response, more heavy boots crunched against the pavement. First Lieutenant James Buzzer Kowalski walked out of the shimmering heat haze, stopping on Sarah's left side. He bent down, picked up a microscopic flake of chipped paint, and casually dropped it into his pocket. He didn't speak. Then came Captain Sarah Viper Chen, her aviator sunglasses hiding her eyes, her posture rigidly straight. She took her place next to Miller, then Major Reynolds, then Lieutenants Harris, Barnes, and Cohen. One by one, the heavy steel door of the ops building swung open and slammed shut. One by one, the pilots of the 27th Fighter Squadron marched out into the suffocating 100-degree heat. They didn't chatter. They didn't make a show of it. They simply formed a long, unbroken, horizontal line stretching across the sun-baked apron, shoulder to shoulder with Sarah. The silence was profoundly, aggressively loud. The only sound was the synchronized, heavy scuffing of 30 pairs of military boots dragging across the concrete and the distant, whining roar of an engine test cell. Sarah felt a violent, trembling pressure build behind her eyes. She bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted copper, violently forcing the tears down. Crying out here would ruin it. Crying would make it about pity, And this wasn't pity. This was a barricade. This was a physical wall built entirely out of bruised egos, aviation fuel, and a shared, silent understanding of exactly what they had survived together. Up in the second-story window of the operations building, the dark, tinted glass reflected the blinding sun. But Sarah knew Albright was up there. He had the corner office. He had the unobstructed view of the entire flight line. She could almost smell the peppermint antacids chalking up in his throat. Albright had wanted a spectacle. He had wanted to isolate the infection, to put the disobedient dog in the yard for everyone to mock. Instead, he was watching his entire command structure, his entire combat-ready roster, willingly stepping into the penalty box. They were daring him to ground them all. "You guys are idiots," Sarah whispered, her voice cracking slightly, raw with a jagged mixture of profound exhaustion and deep affection. "Keep your eyes on the deck, Ghost," Miller murmured beside her, nudging her shoulder roughly with his own. "I think I see a paperclip over there. We wouldn't want the Major's delicate sensibilities offended by foreign debris." They walked. For 45 minutes, they walked the grid. The heat soaked through their Nomex suits, turning the heavy fabric into damp, clinging weights. No one broke formation. No one complained. The sheer physical discomfort was completely overridden by the intoxicating, dangerous thrill of a perfectly executed silent mutiny. Thursday morning fractured instantly. The klaxon didn't buzz. It erupted. It was a terrifying, deeply biological sound, a shrieking electronic wail designed by military psychologists to spike human adrenaline from 0 to maximum in 3 seconds. It vibrated off the corrugated metal walls of the hangar, shaking the cheap coffee in Sarah's mug until it spilled over the rim, burning her fingers. Scramble. Real world. Sarah dropped the mug. It shattered against the linoleum, splashing brown liquid across the toe of her boots. The administrative office descended into organized, violent chaos. Chairs tipped backward, hitting the floor with sharp cracks. Metal lockers slammed open. Radios squawked in a chaotic, overlapping frenzy of encrypted brevity codes. "Unidentified tracks. 2 heavy bombers descending altitude 50 miles off the coast." The duty officer screamed over the klaxon, his face pale, frantically ripping printed telemetry sheets from the secure fax terminal. "Not squawking. They are completely dark." Sarah's muscles twitched. Her entire nervous system screamed at her to run, to grab her helmet bag, to sprint toward the hardened aircraft shelters. But her boots felt bolted to the floor. She was grounded. She was a spectator. Through the thick glass of the ops center, she watched Miller and Kowalski sprinting across the tarmac, their green G-suits hanging half unzipped around their waists, their helmets tucked under their arms like footballs. The ground crews were already tearing the chocks away from the tires of the massive F-22s. Major Albright burst out of his corner office. His uniform was immaculate, but his face was slick with a sudden, terrified sheen of nervous perspiration. This wasn't a training syllabus. This wasn't a paperwork drill. This was 2 deeply hostile, unidentified heavy aircraft penetrating sovereign airspace. And he was the officer nominally in charge of the intercept. "Get them in the air! Go! Go! Go!" Albright yelled, his voice cracking, pitching up into a reedy, panicked squeal. He stood in the doorway, frantically waving his arms, offering absolutely 0 tactical value to the highly choreographed machinery operating around him. Sarah stood near the reinforced glass window, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her fingernails digging painfully into her own biceps. She smelled ozone, hot coffee, and the sharp tang of burning jet fuel drafting in through the ventilation system. The 2 Raptors fired up simultaneously. The sound was apocalyptic. It was a low, gut-wrenching bass frequency that bypassed the ears and vibrated directly inside the chest cavity. The twin Pratt and Whitney turbofan engines screamed, generating thousands of pounds of thrust, pushing a wall of heat distortion so violent it blurred the trees on the far side of the base. Albright practically ran out onto the tarmac, clutching a handheld radio, his tie flapping wildly in the jet wash. He looked small. Incredibly, pathetically small against the towering, dark grey, angular silhouette of the fifth-generation fighters. Miller's jet rolled out of the shelter first. The sleek, predatory nose of the F-22 dipped slightly as he tapped the brakes, turning the heavy aircraft onto the primary taxiway. He was rolling directly past the operations building, exactly where Albright stood on the edge of the concrete, holding his radio and trying to project authority over the deafening noise. Sarah stepped closer to the glass. She pressed her fingertips against the cool, vibrating pane. Albright stood tall, expecting the customary operational acknowledgement from his lead pilot. A nod, a wave, something to validate his position on the tarmac. Miller didn't look at Albright. Inside the tinted, gold-infused canopy of the Raptor, Miller's helmeted head turned sharply to the right. He bypassed the Major completely, locking his gaze entirely on the second-story window of the ops building. He found Sarah standing behind the glass. Slowly, deliberately, Miller raised his heavy, Nomex-gloved hand. He snapped it to the visor of his helmet in a crisp, deeply rigid, flawless salute. He held it. For 3 full seconds, as the multi-million-dollar war machine idled on the taxiway, the flight lead saluted a grounded, desk-ridden captain. Kowalski's jet rolled up right behind him. Kowalski turned his head, bypassed the frantic Major standing on the pavement, and threw the exact same, crisp salute toward the window. The ground crew chiefs, holding their orange-illuminated marshalling wands, stopped their frantic waving. They stood perfectly still, watching the 2 jets idle, watching the pilots acknowledge the ghost in the window. Down on the tarmac, Albright's hand dropped slowly to his side. The handheld radio hung limply from his fingers. He turned his head, tracing the invisible line of sight from the cockpits, up past the brick facade, directly to Sora. Even through the distance, through the thick, vibrating glass, Sarah could see the precise moment the realization hit him. The blood visibly drained from Albright's face. The harsh, midday sun highlighted the sudden, sagging defeat in his posture. He had the rank on his collar. He had the bureaucratic authority to ground her, to make her pick up trash, to strip her of her wings. But he didn't have the squadron. He never would. Sarah didn't smile. She didn't gloat. The hollow, aching tightness in her chest slowly began to loosen, replaced by a quiet, incredibly heavy sense of belonging. She stood at attention, her spine locking completely straight, and raised her hand. She returned the salute, her fingertips brushing the brim of her invisible cap, holding the gesture steady until the twin F-22s pushed their throttles forward, turning their exhaust nozzles to the sky, and roared off the runway, leaving nothing behind but thunder and shattered glass. Thank you for experiencing this story of quiet rebellion and unbreakable bonds on the flight line. If you felt the roar of the engines and the tension on the tarmac, please hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with anyone who appreciates gritty, grounded military drama and true loyalty. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss our next high-altitude story. Stay sharp and keep your eyes on the skies.